Thank you, Harry, and good afternoon, everyone. Over the next few slides, we're going to talk about what is CMMC at its core, how is it structured, and how organizations become certified. Next slide, please. So at its core, CMMC is a unified cybersecurity standard designed to protect information in future DoD acquisitions. And as Harry talked about, CMMC is specifically focused on protecting FCI and CUI. Now that we have a better understanding of what it is, what is the objective of CMMC? To assess and verify the institutionalization and maturity of cybersecurity practices and processes of DoD contractors via third-party assessment. A lot to unpack in this bullet, but the two things I want you to focus on are institutionalization and third-party assessment. We're going to talk more about both of these items in the coming slides. Next, CMMC is at the entity level. XYZ organization will be CMMC level 1 or CMMC level 3. There are individual designations and certifications within the CMMC ecosystem, but when we're talking about the CMMC levels, they are going to be at the entity level. The required CMMC level will be driven by what specific RFPs require. Now, I understand that many of you on the line are obviously suppliers to GDLS, so that will obviously likely drive, what level you need to strive for. So what do I mean by this? The DoD is not going to come to your organization and tell you what CMMC level you need to be. It is possible in this case that GDLS obviously will potentially tell you what level you need to be, but obviously if you have other primes you're working with, that could also impact. So ultimately though, it's going to be a business decision each organization needs to make. Once CMMC is fully implemented, and we'll talk a little bit about the expected timeline in the coming slides, all DoD solicitations will have a specified CMMC level that is required. Lastly, it's expected CMMC will be a replacement for NIST 800-171. Obviously, as Harry talked about, there's been a few shortcomings with NIST 800-171 worth highlighting. So one, obviously self-assessment is a bit different than a third-party assessment. And as you can imagine, companies may have been self-assessing that they had or were planning to implement all 110 controls or practices, but in actuality, probably very few organizations had actually implemented all 110 controls. The other shortcoming of NIST 800-171 is it was one size fits all. As we will see in the coming slides, the number of practices varies significantly depending on the CMMC level. 110 controls might be a bit overkill for an organization that doesn't have CUI on their systems. Next slide, please. So the graphic on the left shows the CMMC model is composed of 17 capability domains. Just think of these as 17 buckets of practices with like attributes. And one thing I want to note, CMMC refers to them as practices, but this is the same as what NIST 800-171 referred to as controls. So Harry talked about earlier, in NIST 800-171, there are 14 families, which are the non-highlighted ones you see in the graphic. With CMMC, they call them domains, and there are 17, with the 3 additional being the ones highlighted with the green boxes. Those are asset management, situational awareness, and recovery. In the graphic to the right, you can see how CMMC is organized into 5 levels. In terms of practices or controls, they range from basic cyber hygiene at level 1 to good cyber hygiene at level 3, all the way to advanced progressive at level 5. We're going to focus on levels 1 through 3 since most of the folks listening in are going to be working towards either levels 1 or 3. To the right of the practices in terms of processes, CMMC is organized by performed at level 1, documented at level 2, and managed at level 3. So what do I mean by that? So performed means that you're doing the required practices at level 1. You don't actually have to have any required processes at level 1. As long as you are performing the required practices and can provide the required evidence, you are compliant. This changes drastically with levels 2 and level 3. Documented at level 2 requires 2 processes. 1, that for each of the domain areas, there's a documented policy. And 2, there are documented practices as to how an organization plans to implement those policies. At level 3, there is 1 process, which requires organizations establish, maintain, and resource a plan demonstrating how they plan to manage the required practices. Plans may include information such as missions, goals, project plans, resourcing, required training, and relevant stakeholders. To summarize, at level 1, there are no required processes. Not that we were recommending that you have no processes if you're going for level 1. We aren't. Level 2 is more of a transition level. Organizations will most likely be striving for either level 1 or level 3. If your organization is going for level 3, you not only need to implement the required practices, but they will have to be implemented the 3 processes I mentioned. So we're going to get more into the practices on the next slide. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a breakout of the practices by each level. There are only 17 practices at level 1, and as I mentioned, there's actually no processes. But this increases significantly with an additional 55 practices at level 2, an additional 58 practices at level 3. So if you're going for level 3, you will need to implement 130 practices in addition to the 3 processes we talked about on the last slide. A key item to note, the 130 practices at level 3 contain the 110 controls from NIST 800-171, plus an additional 20 practices that are CMMC specific. So as you can see, the model is cumulative. In order to meet a specific CMMC level, an organization must meet the practices and processes within that level as well as those below it. Again, we are focusing on levels 1 through 3, but so folks are aware, there are a total of 171 practices when going up to level 5. Next slide, please. So this is just a further depiction of the different domain areas and the different practices. We like to think of CMMC as a 3-legged stool with the 17 domains grouped into buckets of technical, management, and operational. You can see that on the graphic on the left. On the right breaks out the practices by domain and by level. So for example, I know it's a little hard to see, but at level 1, only 6 of the domains apply for the 17 practices. But at level 3, all 17 domains apply for the 130 practices you need to implement. I know I threw a lot of numbers at you. The key ones to remember are at level 1, there's 17 practices, and at level 3, there's 130 practices and 3 processes you need to implement. Next slide, please. So, the big question, how will my company go about achieving a CMMC level certification? So companies will coordinate directly with a certified independent CMMC third-party assessment organization, better known as a C3PAO, to request and schedule a CMMC assessment. Companies can only request an assessment if they have implemented all practices for a requested assessment level. POAMs are not acceptable. So this is clearly a big difference from NIST 800-171. As Harry laid out, as long as you had a system security plan and a POAM and a get well date you were working towards, you were technically compliant. So as you would expect, the C3PAOs are going to come on site to conduct these assessments. A major hurdle of the assessment is that organizations will need to provide the C3PAO 2 types of objective evidence for each practice. The 3 types of objective evidence are interviews, evidence review, and testing. And what I mean by evidence review is they would be reviewing the applicable policy, plans, and artifacts and the like. Once the assessment process is finalized, upon successful demonstration of the appropriate capabilities and organizational maturity, the organization will hopefully receive the corresponding CMMC level certification. Here I want to revisit that term institutionalization. The goal of CMMC is not to have Googled a bunch of policy and plan templates, but rather the goal is to demonstrate that you have truly implemented the necessary practices and policies, and they are ingrained in your organization's culture. So some interesting things that we hear from prospects and clients alike is they want to essentially for us to be able to give them a date of when they're going to be CMMC compliant. And some of them are hoping to be compliant as within 30 days. And realistically, that's not possible because not only do you need to have, if you're going for level 3, the necessary documentation, which is no small feat, you need to be able to show the evidence. And it has to be 2 types of objective evidence that I laid out before. And in order to show that evidence and have it and be able to show it to the assessor, you obviously need to have had these practices in place for a significant period of time that they'll able to come in and objectively discern that you've been saying and doing all the things that you've been saying and documenting in your policies. So another key thing about the assessments is for the most part, assessments are going to be all or nothing. Meaning if you have one practice whether it's out of the 17 for level 1 or the 130 for level 3, you will be non-compliant and you will not have your CMMC certification. Now, one of the things that remains a bit unclear, as is a good bit of CMMC, is that it is possible that minor misses may be remediated after the assessment. But this is up to the assessor. And again, we'll cover this in our risk slide coming up. Lastly, certifications are expected to be valid for 3 years. It is possible, let's say you initially go for level 1 and hopefully achieve it. And let's say you decide that your organization is going to be involved with contracts that involve CUI. You may want to recertify sooner if you're looking to upgrade your level. Next slide, please. So this is just a recap of some key facts and definition. So the CMMC model, that is the model that the DoD put out in terms of the different practices and processes that you need to have in place. The CMMC Accreditation Board, this is a key organization. This is an organization that is run by industry for industry. The board of directors consists of folks that work in the industry. And this organization is responsible for running the program, putting out training, and evaluating and accrediting individual assessors and C3PAOs. So, and then we talked again about the C3PAOs. These are the organizations that you will actually request an assessment from. And this process is very much in development, but we have a link to the CMMC marketplace, and you will be able to look up organizations that are C3PAOs. And we'll touch a little bit more on that during the timeline. Last two CMMC assessments, that's what you will actually request from the C3PAO. That is essentially your audit, you will, of your practices and processes. And lastly, what you hope to obtain is the CMMC certification for whatever level you're striving for. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to just get a little bit into the timeline. Next slide, please. So key things to know. The CMMC standard was only actually released in January 2020. As you can imagine, COVID pushed things to the right, but it is expected that the first solicitations with CMMC requirements will be coming out this year. A few weeks ago, there was a list of the initial 7. We were on a webinar on Friday with Miss Katie Arrington. She's the DoD official in charge of CMMC. She said that number is up to 9. And as Harry talked about, it is expected that come 2026, all DoD solicitations will have a CMMC requirement. And then just going back to what I was talking about with the C3PAOs, only this fall have the past fall were the initial C3PAOs granted their accreditation. So I would say over the next year, there's only a few C3PAOs out on the marketplace right now, but I would expect in the next year, you will hopefully see significantly more so that come time when you're ready to request an assessment, you have options as to who you would like to do your assessment. Next slide, please. So the DoD released this graphic in spring 2020. The idea here, this is the depiction of what Harry talked about with the crawl, walk, run. So in 2021, they said that no more than 15 contracts would have the CMMC requirement in it. Now, that being said, it's only 15 contracts, but as you can see, their graphic shows that they expect this would impact up to 1,500 vendors. And as you can see, each year it's progressively building. But one thing to note is level 1 and level 3 are where they anticipate most vendors will need to be. So, and to sum this all up, it is expected that the CMMC will impact the estimated 300 plus DoD contracts that make up the defense industrial base. And I know there was a question submitted earlier and was answered in the chat, but to at least the latest and greatest, we anticipate if you are a non-US based supplier, you will need to comply with CMMC. There has been no distinction if you're non-US based. If you are considered part of the defense industrial base, you will need to comply with CMMC. Next slide, please. So this is where things are starting to get a little bit more gray, and we'll cover more in our slides, but CMMC and contracts, how is this actually going to function? It is possible that depending on the complexity and number of CLINs in a specific contract, A prime and some subcontractors might not all need to be on the same level. And most likely this is going to be dependent on who is possessing the data, as Harry talked about. If you have CUI that you're in possession putting on your systems, it is likely that you will need to be at least level 3. If perhaps a subcontractor is entering some sort of enclave, then it's possible that, but it's not a system that they own, it's possible that they may be able to remain level 1. That's going to be very contractor specific. And realistically, at this point, no one is entirely sure how this is going to function in terms of contracts. But it is anticipated that it will apply to prime contractors and all subcontractors, meaning that even if you're a subcontractor, it is likely you're going to at least require level 1. Next, the one that people love to talk about, costs. How much is this all going to cost? And sadly, that is still a very TBD conversation. But the DoD did come out and say CMMC certification costs will be allowable costs. Next slide, please. So to cover the risks, and we're going to also touch back on a few topics, including costs. So first, risk time frame. Obviously, they're rolling this out over 5 years. COVID has already pushed it to the right a little bit. And realistically, no one knows how this is going to really play out in terms of how quickly are these contracts going to have CMMC requirements. We know there's the initial 9, but we don't know how many is going to be next year and the year after that. The best thing we can do, and we're going to talk about this more, is just start working as soon as possible. Next, the C3PAOs, they're only being selected and trained now. So in terms of the timing of the assessments, there's a lot unclear with that. The DoD has come out and said that they're obviously going to encourage C3PAOs to focus on the vendors that are obviously impacted by the 9 pilot programs that are coming out first, which makes sense. And you would think as additional solicitations come out that impact vendors, you would like to think that vendors that are impacted by those solicitations would have some sort of priority. But realistically, that's not written in black and white anymore. Next, how will the government determine CMMC levels? So there's what the DoD has in terms of what CUI is, but a big unknown in this piece is that the DoD acquisition workforce, which is obviously significant, they're going to need to be trained on what CUI is and what CMMC is to make sure that these standard is applied correctly in contracts. And that's obviously going to be a significant effort to train the DoD acquisition workforce. Next, will the government be able to exclude businesses by CMMC level? Could they potentially deem that certain data is CUI, and will that result in much less vendors being able to bid on the contract? Really, we don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how CMMC is actually applied at the contract level. Next, how will the standard be practically assessed? To date, at least to our knowledge, no one has actually gone through an assessment. And in early December, the DoD finally released the assessment methodology, which is essentially what the C3PAOs are going to be reviewing when they come on site to conduct these assessments. And we now have a standard, which is a huge step in the right direction, just in terms of when we're working with our clients to help them better understand what the assessors are going to be looking for. But in terms of how an assessment is actually going to go, and that unknown I talked about earlier about what is, they've left a little window of there could be minor remediations that are allowed to be fixed in some sort of 90-day period following an assessment, but no one really knows what will be considered minor enough that a company will have the opportunity to remediate that and still pass their certification. And then lastly, of course, what is the true cost of certification and maintenance? I've seen this question asked on almost every webinar I've been on, which has been quite a number in the last few months. And that's really just going to be depend. And I know that's not the answer people want to hear, but it's going to depend on, do you need to go for level 1 or level 3? Level 3, as we talked about, is obviously significantly more involved than level 1. And then it also is going to depend on what is the size of your organization and what is the type of data that you're maintaining on your systems. One thing that Miss Katie Arrington brought up on a webinar we were on Friday that I thought was really interesting is she's hoping that CMMC serves as a sort of equalizer for companies that have had strong cybersecurity posture. And what I mean by that is companies to date, let's say you were self-assessing, but you were truly trying to or successfully implemented those 110 controls with NIST 800-171, there was probably a significant cost that went into making that happen. Whereas, unfortunately, there's many companies out there that were self-assessing and that they were compliant that probably didn't do a lot differently. And then come bid time, they didn't have those same costs that other companies may have invested in terms of whether it's in-house cybersecurity resources or some sort of cybersecurity tools. Um, so she's hoping that there's somewhat of a normalization in terms of that all companies, because of this CMMC process, are going to need to reflect those costs in their rates. So when come bid time, that there won't be some sort of unfair advantage. If you are a company that is now CMMC certified, you've now realized those costs in your rates. So I thought that was a key thing to highlight that Ms. Arrington had brought up the other day.